Good morning. So you all heard it. Now my wife knows what I'm doing up at 4:30 in the morning. In all seriousness, for as long as I've been doing this work, and for certainly the last decade or more, M&T Bank and Allen Naples have been just remarkable partners in this community. Their efforts to support our innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, efforts to lend to projects, critical projects like the Hotel Syracuse, these are signs of leadership, and we owe Allen and M&T Bank and Gary Keith a deep round of applause. Thank you very much. And to all of you, our members, our partners, our friends, for your efforts day in and day out to help grow and support this regional economy. Not surprisingly, the insights that you offered us, which you see in the economic forecast report this year, are very much in keeping with the sentiments that Gary just presented from the stage. 68% of our forecasters say they anticipate overall sales and revenue growth in 2017, slightly higher than what was projected for 2016. A year ago at this time, 63% of our survey respondents projected revenue growth for 2016, but actually 75% of them reported that they did in fact grow last year. Last year, again, 47% expected corporate profits to increase, and this year, the projection is 49%, again, a slight improvement. In 2017, 53% of you expect to be hiring, and just 8% of you are projecting job losses in your business or in your industry. Anticipated export growth is also trending up, although I agree with Gary with the uncertainty at the national level around international trade. This is a big variable. But 67% of our survey respondents are saying they have plans to grow their exports in 2017, something that generates net new wealth and net new jobs for this region with every single sale. The most positive news of all, you saw at the end of Gary's presentation, is for employees. It is pretty amazing when you think about it. Per capita income growth, private sector payroll incomes, in an environment where our economy is still 70% dependent on consumer spending, more wages means more economic activity, which is good for every single one of our businesses. But not all of the region's economic indicators are positive. GDP and employment growth significantly lag the nation. And what's most startling to me about the findings that Gary presented is the significant discrepancy between Central New York and our peer communities across the Thruway. Last spring in our annual meeting, we talked about breaking through the status quo, because what we're experiencing right now in this region isn't acceptable to any of us, and is certainly not that which we desire. I think the report and the outlook shared by our members and the very clear message from Gary are an affirmation that the status quo in this region is still very much alive and well. So at some point we have to wake up and we have to look at ourselves in the mirror and we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question. Why are we not keeping up? Why is Albany growing at 11%? Why is Buffalo growing at 9%? And why are we lagging in the ways in which we are? So for starters, if you look at those two individual communities, in Buffalo, Palo Alto, California-based Tesla and Tokyo-based Panasonic are building a factory to begin production of photovoltaic cells by mid-2017. The project will create 1,400 jobs in Buffalo, 500 in manufacturing, and Tesla has plans for further expansion in the Buffalo area. And just as businesses are looking to new technologies for growth, they're also working to adapt and innovate yesterday's technologies to evolve their businesses and advance new industries. Like in Rochester, just down the road, where photonics industry is experiencing some explosive growth. Fiber optics is a key technology for the IT and telecom businesses, and the market for digital imaging applications and flat panel displays is growing exponentially. Companies like Eastman Kodak are building on their own legacies, helping Rochester compete in the global economy. Our peer cities are evolving and diversifying their economies in profound ways, and we are not keeping pace. In conversations with some of our forecasters, it's apparent that we still have nostalgia for some of the businesses and industries that we've lost here in this region, which inhibits us from putting our full attention where it belongs on the types of economic opportunities that we can conceivably grasp in the future. This rearward-looking focus isn't the only inhibitor, to be sure. In fact, I think it's fitting that Gary led his discussion talking about something that's a common refrain from all of you and our forecasters over the course of the past 5 years: political dysfunction. In fact, our members have repeatedly called out the negative impacts of regulatory pressures and the lack of collaboration amongst elected officials, both locally and nationally, as the leading challenge for the growth of their businesses. If we aren't all pulling in the same direction as a community, how can we possibly expect to move forward? If there's one question that has dominated our discussions with members, our civic partners, collaborators over the past year, it's been this: how do we as a community break this ineffective and stifling cycle? I think the answer is simple. You heard Gary refer to it at the end. At the end of the day, it is time for the business community and for our civic partners to lead. First, we must lead with our voice. In the coming weeks, the Consensus Commission on Government Modernization will release its final recommendations in response to more than 11,000 comments generated by the public by its draft report. The passion generated by this discussion from people on all sides has been one of the most robust civic discussions that I've seen in my time here in Syracuse. But among our members and the business community at large, we have heard an overwhelming call for action from a formidable body of evidence that demonstrates just how inefficient and ineffective our current models of service delivery really are. In Onondaga County alone, we handle tax assessments 17 different ways. We manage criminal justice via 28 separate courts. We provide public works via 36 different departments. All this against a backdrop of a community where 18 of Onondaga County's 35 towns and villages lost population between 2000 and 2010, and wherein the county as a whole has 5,000 fewer residents than it did in 1970. If that isn't enough to concern you, the fiscal pressures facing our local governments are accelerating. A year ago, when we released our draft options report, our analysis projected that 20 of the 36 municipalities in Onondaga County would face potential deficits within a decade. Just a year later, as we prepare the release of the final report, that analysis now shows 27 of our 36 municipalities face potential fiscal deficits within the next decade. That leaves difficult choices. Fewer services, higher property taxes when more and more municipalities choose to violate the 2% property tax cap, or, God forbid, perhaps if we can come together and find ways to work together, collaboration, partnership, and consolidation to hold the line on spending and improve services for our residents here in Onondaga County. Now, the number one question I've heard about consensus recently is what comes next? What will they, our elected leaders, do with the report and its recommendations? But respectfully, and I think in keeping with the tone that Gary said at the end of his remarks, I think that's the wrong question. Earlier this year, we commissioned an independent poll by Siena Research Group to look at the attitudes of voters in Onondaga County on these issues, and the findings were unambiguous. 67% of voters favor consolidation of infrastructure services like DPW and water. 61% support the consolidation of municipal operations, such as assessment and code enforcement. And by a 55% to 41% margin, voters support consolidation of local governing entities as well. Now, if you live in Onondaga County, the question is not what local elected officials or the Consensus Commission will do. The question is, what will you do? How will you use your voice and your vote to drive the changes that are real and necessary and obvious to all of those of us in this room? Because the quickest way to maintain the status quo when it comes to local governments is waiting for someone else to act. So what will we do? Speaking of waiting, in the past 6 months, our community has lost 2 major opportunities for the siting and location of large warehousing and distribution facilities in our region. Each of these opportunities offered the potential for hundreds of much-needed jobs for our region and as many as 1 million square feet of new warehousing and distribution space. It's tragic when we miss any opportunity against the backdrop of our economic performance, but this is self-inflicted. Without a political agreement on a site for an inland port, and without a commitment to invest in the infrastructure needed to build out a world-class global manufacturing and logistics hub that this region called for last year, we continue to miss opportunities to attract new business to this region and create jobs. What's worse, our inaction is imperiling existing jobs and businesses, as new regulations and market pressures are threatening to drive up the cost of importing and exporting in central New York. Electronic logging for the trucking industry threatens to make what is now a day trip to the Port of New York and New Jersey a 2-day excursion. And what was once a highly competitive ocean freight environment with as many as 30 major providers is quickly consolidating into a market of 3 major shipping alliances, decreasing competition, threatening the same monopolistic pricing pressures similar to those we've seen with the rail industry domestically. Day after day, article shows up in my email with the facts. South Carolina's inland port was so successful, they're building a second one. Real estate prices around our coastal ports are now so high that shippers are looking inland for new distribution and warehousing hubs. And our own Port of New York and New Jersey has just unveiled a 10-year, $32 billion capital plan that is investing billions of dollars in alleviating congestion from projected new freight traffic. And yet, some of our elected leaders still need to be convinced of the market opportunity. Is there any wonder we are falling behind our peers? When we do nothing, we lose ground. We now have a town board in Camillus that would welcome the investment. We have a property owner in Honeywell that is eager to partner, and we have nearly 1,000 acres of developable real estate that we could put to work. So it's time for every manufacturer, agricultural producer, logistics company, and business that depends on imports and exports to demand a solution and demand the start of construction for this inland port facility here in central New York in 2017. The time is now to make this happen. While we're on the topic of advocacy for major issues facing this community, let's talk about Interstate 81. Over the last 7 years, we have been asked to attend dozens of public meetings, sit on countless work groups, and read and react to report after report about the options for the reconfiguration of this highway. We've seen 4 different viaducts, 7 different tunnels, 4 boulevards, 2 community grids, a half dozen community generated and hybrid ideas, and a no-build option that really isn't an option at all. And soon, in the not-too-distant future, we will face a choice. It's a 100-year choice about the type of community we want to be, not only for tomorrow, but for a future beyond many of our lifetimes. Millennials are driving less, not more. Autonomous vehicles are changing the way we move and are likely to result in less congestion, not more. But make no mistake, this is far more than a transportation decision. For a region that, as Gary pointed out, is struggling to grow and expand our labor pool, making our city and region as attractive as possible to our next generation workforce is critical to our long-term economic sustainability. Transformative. 3 years ago, CenterState CEO articulated 5 core values for our decision-making around this important project, but none are more important than that one word. It is now time to get all of the facts on the table, all of the engineering analyses, all of the pros, all of the cons, all of the costs, and make sure we fully understand all of the alternatives. Because every option has some form of negative impact. But not every option is transformative. And in the end, that is what this community needs the most: transformation, new investment, and a better solution than we received 60 years ago. On each and every one of these issues and a half a dozen more, Your voice matters. I suggest that now is the time to use it. In fact, there is only one thing more powerful than when the private sector speaks with one voice, and that is when you lead by example. 5 years ago, companies like SRC, Saab, and Lockheed Martin recognized the significant growth in the unmanned systems industry and played a leadership role in attracting one of 6 FAA-designated test sites. Today, as you heard Andrew describe, that leadership is translated into conversations with more than 150 companies all over the world that are considering investment right here in Central New York. It's translated into a 50-mile corridor, the largest live-scale test bed for unmanned systems anywhere in the world. And we are now converting innovation and entrepreneurial programming that folks like M&T and National Grid have been investing in for a decade and running the Genius New York competition, the world's largest unmanned systems accelerator, which is bringing some of the most promising companies in this field together for a year-long incubation and acceleration experience right here in downtown Syracuse. Moreover, actually, if you look carefully, this type of leadership that we've seen from the private sector, it's not just reserved for our high-tech companies. Many of our legacy businesses are charging forward without waiting for the public sector to catch up. Burn Dairy, an 84-year-old family-owned and operated dairy processor, is doing just that, investing in aseptic packaging technology, extending the shelf life of their certain products over 1 year. It's opening new markets for the company and reminding every single one of us what it takes to stay competitive and to create jobs right here in Central New York. But nowhere is the power of the private sector to lead by example more apparent nor more needed than when it comes to the and underrepresented workers in our region. We all know about the pernicious poverty, the economic segregation. We've seen story after story in our newspaper and our media over the course of the last several years. But what is less well known, and what we intend to spend some of 2017 talking about, are highlighting the examples of our own members who are doing their part to make a direct and positive human impact of their own. St. Joseph's Hospital and Loretto have made efforts to include often ignored populations in their recruitment and training programs through efforts like Health Train. Companies like Darco Manufacturing, Novellus up in Oswego, and RMS, who helped us prepare today's report, are also leading by example. They are focusing on diversity in their hiring. They're working to reduce or eliminate barriers to employment, such as transportation or childcare, and they are making an intentional commitment to be a part of the solution. And VIP Structures, they have quietly partnered over the course of the last 18 months with the Urban Jobs Task Force. Together, they are making sure that job opportunities for the construction of the new Price Right on South Ave are open and accessible to the residents of that neighborhood who need jobs just as much as they need fresh food. These companies don't see issues of poverty and economic segregation as a challenge beyond their sphere of impact. These businesses and organizations understand that those numbers that we read in the newspaper represent people, our neighbors, individuals looking to get a foothold in our economy and work their way up. And instead of waiting on someone else to help, they are rolling up the sleeves and they are leading by example. So here we are at the beginning of a new year, receiving a very similar message from Gary as we received last year, and frankly, the year before that. A year of low expectations, lagging growth, of opportunity just over the horizon. So what are we going to do? I don't know about you, but when I am faced with a particularly vexing problem, I often find myself reflecting back on my past experiences, looking for some kernel of advice that might have been imparted upon me somewhere along the way that would point towards a solution. So here I was several weeks ago listening to Gary on the phone, who was giving me a preview of today's findings. And we were talking about the rut that the Central New York economy is stuck in. We were talking about what it takes to break free from that cycle and about how hard it is to cast aside an entrenched narrative and write a new chapter for this region. Somebody has to break the logjam, Gary said stoically as we closed our conversation. And suddenly I was back in my kitchen in Whitesboro, New York. I was standing at the sink, washing dishes after dinner, although my mom might dispute that, baking cookies, probably more than likely washing my hands after gathering frogs in the creek behind our house. And there, right there, eye level, placed in a way that you could not miss it, you could not ignore it, was a simple painted wooden sign hanging from a hook. Probably saw it 5 or 6 times a day in my youth growing up, probably over 1,000 times a year, probably 10,000 times before we left that house. My parents sold it, and that sign was consigned to a drawer or a box or something else. Haven't seen it since, but it is forever imprinted on my mind. I close my eyes, I see it as vividly as I was when I was 9 years old. I always wondered why somebody didn't do something about that, it said. And then I realized that I'm somebody. I do not believe for a second that there is not a single person in this room that doesn't want something better for this community than the forecast that Gary Keith just presented for 2017. And 600 people in this room are a lot of somebodies. Our present circumstance does not dictate our future condition. What defines the future, more than anything, is what you do today, tomorrow, the day after. What you do for your business, what you do together for this region. But let there be no mistake, the statistics are unambiguous. We can't simply hunker down and ride this out. We can't wait for things to change. We have to work for it, we have to demand it, and we have to accept nothing less. And if you in this room and your peers in the private sector are willing to stand up and stand together, then there isn't a single civic or political force that can stand in your way. Friends, members, and partners, the time for waiting is over. 2017 is here. It is time to lead with our voice, to lead by example, and to lead this region to a brighter and more prosperous future. Thank you all very much.